Hello and welcome to Spy Hard's podcast. I'm Agent Scott.
And I'm Cam the Provocateur, intrigued by the zither.
We all are. We're zither heads here.
That's right, and I am intrigued.
Very intrigued. And we are continuing our celebration. We've had a summer of celebrations for our 4th birthday to our first live show. And we're celebrating another birthday this week.
Yes, we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of The Third Man, the classic 1949 film noir spy thriller directed by Carol Reed.
And we're not celebrating in the sense of having a full-on review. We've brought a true expert on this week. Joining us in just a few moments is Mr. John Walsh, who is releasing his book, The Third Man, the official story of the film, on the 24th of September. Cam and I have had a sneak peek at the book. It's absolutely fantastic, and it tells the full story of The Third Man. And we're going to get into it with John in just a minute. But you can also win a copy of the book. And if you want to hear more about that, stick around to the end of the show for some more details. You can also find out more on Twitter. But Cam, without further ado, let's celebrate The Third Man in style. Roll it. Well, Cam, you know we love a spy movie here, and so we have no expertise, and we like to bring in some experts. And joining us is one hell of an expert celebrating one hell of a film. He is a 2-time BAFTA-nominated filmmaker, a best-selling author, and his new book, The Third Man, the official story of the film, is published on the 24th of September. Hello, John Walsh. How are you?
I'm very well, guys. Hello, Scott. Hello, Cam.
Hello, how are you doing?
Yes, very well. I'm excited. Got another book out the gate, as it were, off the blocks as a launch. You know, publishing people have different ways of doing these things, but it's new.
No, The Third Man is a film we haven't actually ever talked about in our 4 and a bit years of doing Spy Hard's podcast. Amazingly, we've never spoken about this film.
It's surprising because there's so many links and ties to James Bond, to spycraft, between actors, technical people, the fact that Ian Fleming and Graham Greene, the writer of The Third Man, knew each other very well indeed. So yeah, what a unique opportunity to crack open that egg.
Well, it feels like a movie that we talk to, a lot of guests, and we do a lot of interviews, and people frequently cite this as one of their favorite spy films. But it's a movie that almost hangs on the side of the espionage genre, because it's definitely a very, the whole setting of Vienna post-war is like a hotbed of espionage. But the movie, I don't know that it necessarily counts as like a spy film. It's very much like film noir. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it kind of is and it isn't. If we think that much like North by Northwest, where George Kaplan or Roger Thornhill, was the accidental spy in that sort of narrative. Holly Marston's in this film, played by Joseph Cosson, is a similar person. He's unexpectedly arrived in Vienna. He's come to meet his friend Harry Lime. He discovers that Harry is dead and starts to investigate in a kind of an amateur sleuth way. And he's kind of met with all sorts of blocks between the British Army, represented by Trevor Howard, and then locals. So he's kind of an amateur sleuth. And I think amateur sleuths are sometimes the best types. I've been listening to some of your guys' episodes on Condor Man and Ishtar. Amateur sleuths are the kind of are the meat and potatoes of the narrative world. But outside of James Bond, who's like the professional spy, amateur sleuths seem to be kind of scooping up all the other good films.
Well, that's very true.
I can't believe we're being judged on our Condor Man and Ishtar coverage, but to be fair, I almost wouldn't want it any other way.
Well, sometimes it's great for films like Condor Man to be recognized. It's a shame. I rate Condor Man. It's got a great Henry Mancini score, and yet there's never been a Blu-ray release for the film. Disney Plus don't have the film on their channel yet. So haven't got it as part of their archive, which is a shame. There's lots of great films, and Ishtar has been rediscovered, as you rightly said in your podcast. So the Third Man didn't go through any sort of ignominious stage like that, but it was sort of, I won't say forgotten, but it was better remembered in the sort of the 60s, and then things happened in the 70s. So I think it's kind of had a reemergence. But I would consider it a spy film, definitely.
I think it definitely, makes the grade. I don't think there'll be any arguments from our listeners that Third Man isn't a spy movie. But it is an interesting one of those sort of stories that isn't necessarily grounded in, your protagonist is a full-on, 007, or he's Austin Powers, he is a man of mystery, that sort of thing. It is a sort of the wrong man in the wrong situation, and then has to rise up to the challenge, in this case, to figure out what happened to Harry Lime. But I want to take us back a little bit, because I want to talk about Third Man with you, sort of unpack it, but get us to the Third Man for you. Where did this love of the film come from? What it sort of inspired you to want to talk about the Third Man and do a book about it in the first place?
Well, I've always been a fan of the film. It used to be on sort of wet Wednesday afternoons here in the UK. I first saw it when I was a student at the London Film School, and they had quite a ropey print that they borrowed from the BFI, the British Film Institute. And I thought, wow, this is amazing. It's a wonderful sort of thriller with twists and turns. And the more I found out about the director Carol Reed and then Alexander Korda and the behind the scenes kind of kerfuffles that went on, I thought, wow, one day there should be a book in this. And of course, other people have written books about the Third Man in terms of what the film has to say. So there's been academic books. And of course, what happened behind the scenes. So there's been sort of making of books before, but nothing in terms of this size and scale, and nothing officially. So for 75 years, the rights holder for the film has never allowed a license to be issued. And the reason that makes a difference is because it means I can delve into all sorts of paperwork. I've got book covers of making of books on Conan the Barbarian, Escape from New York, Doctor Who and the Daleks, Flash Gordon, and The Wicker Man. And The Wicker Man came from the same production company eventually as The Third Man did, but a few decades later under different ownership. Studio Canal now owns most of these titles that I've mentioned, and they've retained lots of the paperwork, insurance, materials, the daily report sheets, and the completion guarantee. You can find out who's misbehaved and for how and for why. So to be able to sort of factually get things right and come up with figure work and reveal some of the behind the scenes kind of scrapes there were between the actors, the director, the two different producers on different sides of the Atlantic in the film for different reasons, pulling in opposite directions. I kind of thought that in some ways, and this is a sacrilegious thing to say, the making of is perhaps even more interesting than the film itself. So, in some ways, and I have been speaking to rights holders about this in recent years, about looking again at some of these films from a sort of documentary drama perspective, and maybe revisiting the stories of how these films are made, what it says about the film industry at the time. If you look at Paramount Plus's series The Offer, which looked at the making of the Godfather series from the early 70s, David Evans and Paramount Pictures and so on, that worked extremely well for a mainstream audience. So I think that these books potentially have those legs. But The Third Man was one that I don't think I could have had published a few years ago, because I think there might not have been within the publishing world an expectation that it would sell well enough. And after doing a few books here that have sold very well indeed, and support from Studio Canal, the rights holders, we thought now's the right time. The film's getting a 75th anniversary reissue in 4K, and it's right to kind of rub alongside publishers like that, someone else doing something that's even more risky, so that they can kind of throw their hat in the ring or their chips on the table. And we kind of spun the dice on it.
Well, I was going to ask you, because you've written books on Conan the Barbarian, Doctor Who, The Wicker Man. Was there any sort of like pushback from like your publisher saying like, we kind of get what you do? Like a lot of these are like cult films and very popular cult films. Like The Third Man kind of exists a little bit outside of what typically you've been writing. Or were they just like, you know what? We've liked what you've done before. Go nuts.
Yeah, it was that.
Good.
Because
that's the best case.
Earlier on, when I proposed Doctor Who as a book, they felt that it would probably sell in the UK quite well, but internationally, possibly not. And because all of my books are distributed worldwide by Tyson Books, and, to all bookshops, small vendors, big vendors, Amazon, and so on, it has to work on a worldwide platform. So I think Doctor Who was the one that really proved that if you pushed a book hard enough and had a good social media presence, you can make it sell. And so it was easier for them to say yes, actually, on The Third Man. They were keen to do this collaboration. I think we were all on the same page. Some of the books I've pitched and some of the books they've offered, and as we've kind of matured along together, we've kind of melded into one. So they kind of know what I'm thinking, and I kind of know what they expect in terms of delivery. So we've sort of merged together.
And I wanted to ask you, because you said, you love The Third Man. Did you always love The Third Man? Was it a movie that, like, the first time you saw it, there was like a magic there? Or was it a movie that, for me, there's been several classics where I watched it the first time when I'm young and I kind of go like, okay. And it's the revisits that really win me over.
Yeah, I think I liked it when I saw it, but I never thought I'll do a book about that one day. Um, so it was when I found out more about Carol Reed and Alexander Korda and David O. Selznick, the king of Hollywood at that time. And I found out, wow, is that what really happened on The Third Man? You'd never have thought. The film is quite polite in many ways. And it was only when I discovered more of the behind the scenes aspects to it, when I rewatched the film, I was watching it then with fresh eyes. And I was like, wow, so that's not Orson Welles in that scene and in this scene and in the other scene. It's the director, the assistant director standing in for him, wearing a coat with hangers in the shoulders to fill it out. So as the sort of the myth of the film fell apart, as I found out more about it, I would revisit it with new eyes. And most of the people who read my books say, I've rewatched the film now. I'll never think of it again in the same way, whether it's Doctor Who, Flash Gordon, and so on. Flash Gordon had 3 times the budget of the first Star Wars film, and yet there is no motion control on any of the spaceship special effects.
Yeah.
It's like, how's that possible? And the flying is not as good as Superman the movie from 1978, 79. And yet this film came out in 1980, yet they had as a comparable budget to Superman. I always want to know the answers to those questions, and I got them and put them in the book. There were similar questions I wanted answered for The Third Man. So you kind of work up this shopping list of, gosh, if I ever got a dinner party, fantasy dinner party with all these people around the table, what would you ask Alfred Hitchcock or Stanley Kubrick and so on? And so in a way, these books help me satisfy some of that obsessive wish list questions I have about why did that happen? And surely that's not right.
Well, you kind of teased it right there. What were some of those burning questions you needed to have answered?
What was David O. Selznick, undoubtedly the king of Hollywood, doing working on a co-production on a medium to average low budget European feature film, which was being filmed in Vienna because Sir Alexander Korda, the British Hungarian producer, had money kind of stuck there after the war. You couldn't easily kind of do a bank transfer, so had to film something in situ on a story that's it's about penicillin that's been watered down, and it's like a
Yeah.
boy meets girl. Girl is disinterested in everyone. Selznick didn't like the title, didn't like the casting, didn't like Wells, wanted Cary Grant, had Alida Valli and Joseph Cotton under contract to himself, and so was toying with whether they'd be involved or not. I was like, what was Selznick even thinking, wasting his time on what's a minor film? It turns out, of course, David O. Selznick, who's a brilliant man, not to take anything away from him, was going through a financial crisis at the time, was hoping to hook his wagon to Korda and make some money and dig himself out of a financial hole he got himself into, despite making the most successful film in cinema history with Gone with the Wind, and following it up with Rebecca as well, which was Best Picture. So 2 Best Pictures back to back. So that was always a curio to me. How Graham Greene got involved and why he made the film the way he did. It was very much Korda who drove the story into Vienna, not Greene. Greene was out there and was frustrated. He'd been sent there by Korda. He was doing it for the money. Wells didn't want to be in the picture. He was doing it for the money. And Wells, where possible, tried not to be in the picture. So we go through all of those sort of bizarre questions of, if it's one of Orson Welles' most famous films, why did he not really want to be there? What was really going on? And of course, Wells had the worst of all addictions, which I've had myself. And when people at home now are thinking, oh, why? What addiction could that be? It's the worst, most expensive, self-destructive addiction anyone can have. Financing your own film projects with your own money. And it sent poor old Orson Welles into a tailspin, a life lived like a kind of a French monarch in exile, but also in poverty. I don't know how he managed both at the same time, but all those questions, we try and straighten out the myths, the untruths as well about the supposedly Orson Welles' inspiration in the Ferris wheel sequence and the cuckoo clock speech, which he claims he came up with, which is only partly true. We straightened out the history on that. For previous books like The Wicker Man, where Christopher Lee for many years went around defaming the producers of British Line films Mike Dealey and Barry Spikings over what really happened to the final cut, we were able to kind of put that record straight, much to the frustration of fans who were holding on to the coattails of Christopher Lee's memory and the terrible story he told about the destruction of that film. But for the official versions, we kind of need to get it right. So these are more like public inquiries in a sense. So I gather together all the witnesses and all the statements and try and say, look, we, the rights holder, through me, think this is the truth. And I hope for the third man that we've managed to do that. And, you know, it's interesting. It's 75 years old. I think it's the oldest film I've written about, and yet it still offers up secrets all these years later, which is quite spooky.
Well, I think it sort of segues beautifully into one thing I wanted to talk about, because, you know, with our interview series, we do our SpyMaster interviews here on the show. What we try to do is set the record straight from people who were there and hear their stories about film and try and get that into the public record. So it's a thing that I have a lot of pride in doing. It's nice to see that you do too, in sort of, you know, getting the story straight and putting it out there, and fact checking as well. I think is a very important part of all this. But putting these books together, because you talk about, like, you know, it wasn't Orson Welles casting The Shadow. It was the chap in a with a coat hanger on it, and like stuff like that. I was reading the book, and it gave, ironically, the third man a second life for me. You know, you've just sort of like you cast a whole new shadow over the whole thing by just that little secret alone. And there's hundreds more in the book. And if you're a fan of the third man, I completely suggest picking up a copy of the book. It's absolutely worth it and deserves to be on your shelf if you love the book, if you love the film.
Yep.
Even if you don't love the film, if you love filmmaking, it's one to pick up. But, you know, these are works of passion, works of love for cinema. And I want to know, because this isn't your first official story of the film book, how do you go about putting these books together?
Well, there's kind of two things that happen. The kind of the practical side of things and the expectation from the publisher, where I kind of create what's called a treatment. And the treatment is very much based on, when I'm working for television and making a documentary series, you don't know really what you're going to get until you start filming, and yet you're expecting the commitment in terms of money up front. So the treatment kind of talks about what we hope to find, and if we find it, how we will treat that information, and an end goal. So kind of a, if you like, a wish list of moments. So within the book, I recreate that as chapters. You know, if we were playing fantasy publisher here and fantasy author, this is what I'd like to be able to tell you, the publisher I have found. And so I'll create, as it were, a kind of a spine for the book that carries you through all aspects from beginning, the middle, the end, and sort of legacy aspects. But then actually finding that information, verifying it, is really the task. And the book stays in my head and all the pieces move around along with the images, because I'm often sent an enormous data dump of lots of photographs, almost always with just reference numbers on them. So you're having to spot if it's Orson Welles or if it's Trevor Howard. Fine, we can do that. But what when it's minor players from Vienna or crew members? There's only one member of the crew still alive from the third man. There's no cast left, just one crew member. Oh, there is one cast left, the boy, the 2-year-old boy.
The baby who gets a 2-page spread, which I think is just great. When I turned that page, I was like, wow, that kid's getting the treatment.
So it's that. So I kind of work through to find what's out there, and then sort of try and shape it in terms of the images we've got, because these books have to sell in terms of their visuals. So there's all that kind of pressure that I wouldn't say it's a slight pull and tug against the images, against the text, because on some of them I wanted bigger books. On Doctor Who and the Daleks, I wanted a much bigger book. I wanted it to be 2 books because it's 2 movies.
Yeah.
So it's a case of trying to fit into what the publisher expects. They'll look at what I'm doing if they want to. In the beginning, they were looking quite closely. Now they look less closely. And I offer up chapters and pieces as I'm doing it so they can get a sense of where it's going. For the third man, we had involvement with Graham Greene's actual family.
Cool.
So it was important that we got this right. And because there's some sensitivities around the fact that Graham Greene stayed in touch intentionally with this country's biggest tracer, Kim Philby.
Hmm.
It was important that we were sensitive to the people who are alive in Philby's family who still live here. I was in touch with Kim Philby's granddaughter, and I'm in touch obviously with Graham Greene's surviving family. So when there's existing contributors who are still alive, like Sam Jones on Flash Gordon, and there's contentions around his story, it's making sure that contributors feel looked after and that the publisher gets what they need, but the public can rely on the fact that it's true and verified. And so the book just stays in my head. It's really hard to get the book back out again. It's like learning lines for a play. Once you have them in there, you kind of they're kind of tattooed on your brain somewhere.
Hmm.
So the pieces keep moving around along with the pictures. I speak to the fan base. If fans give me interesting information pieces, that always affects things, and you kind of slot them in. But it's just important to hit schedules and hit deadlines. I've never missed in terms of film and TV or publishing any deadlines. I know authors like to say, "Oh, I'd like to see a deadline whiz past." I think Douglas Adams famously said that it inspires him to get on with things. Knowing there's a delivery date actually can make you quite anxious. It makes me anxious. So I always make sure that I get asked this a lot at Q&As. How do you start with a book of this size? And I said, well, I think of the old Hindu proverb, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. So whilst you can think of the book as a whole, I think it's best to concentrate on what you can do that day, but always do something that day, even if you don't feel like it or you have a headache. Writer's block doesn't come into it. You need to work, and you need to work often, because it's through small bites you'll complete the 50,000 or however many words it is you need to do for that particular project.
Well, I was going to ask, because you talk about the process of putting these books together. Has there ever been one where it was a movie you were passionate about and you wanted to do something with, and you just got to a point where you're like, I just don't have enough here for a book?
No, but I have pitched books which the publisher was like, no, we're not doing that. I was like, oh. A lot of it is that if they can get me the license. So we have that conversation first. Can you get me the license for this or for that? And then if they can get the license, would the book sell? And then you're sometimes in a position where some of the big rights holders will say, we'll give you 5 licenses or 10 licenses at once, not one, because the paperwork for them means that they'd have to keep revisiting and so on. But I mean, that's not practical for a publisher to buy 5 or 10 licenses. And particularly they have time limits. The licenses are like a reverse option. And the publisher needs to sell as many books as possible in that 5-year period to make money back. There's lots of books out there I want to write, and and then they are looking at more seriously at my big wish list, which keeps getting bigger. And this is the thing that publishers have learned, is that an unsuccessful film can make a successful book. And if you think of, here's an example, and this is one I've pitched, and I hope you don't chuck me off from this wonderful podcast if I say it, but I fancy doing Howard the Duck as a book.
Yeah.
And Howard the Duck has had a 4K remaster by Universal Pictures, and it's the best measure to say, you know what? There's not only a secondary audience out there for it, there is an audience that'll come back again because it's in 4K. Not everyone's cup of tea, but there are lots of unsuccessful films that have amazing backstories that would make fabulous books.
Condor Man, perhaps?
Condor Man, definitely. Why not? There's a bunch of Disney ones that I want to do, and I've put together my list of Disney 5 because they are the company that have said we'll issue 5 licenses at once, but not one at a time. So it's like, oh, okay. I exchanged letters with Bob Iger over my first book, and he was super nice about it. I'm a trustee of the Ray Harryhausen Foundation, and we're the biggest animation archive outside of the Walt Disney Company. But we have just 3 trustees, I'm one, and 1 member of staff, whereas the Walt Disney Company has like battalions of staff. So we exchanged nice letters, which was really sweet.
I'm just hoping that The Great Locomotive Chase from 1956 is on your list of 5 Disney films, because that's another one that's near and dear to my heart.
It's not, but I'm happy to put that on there.
It's definitely worth a little visit, I'd say, for everyone. Just if you like Fez Parker, just chuck it on. Why not? But you talk about the process of putting these books together, and you seem to have got it down to a bit of an art now. When you're in the process of putting them together, Yeah, see, the third man is your target this time. What is something that you have found about the third man through going through these archives and reading these stories and doing interviews, I imagine, or talking to people? What's sort of the most surprising fact about the film that you stumbled across?
Um, the amount of, we just talked about this earlier, people who didn't want to be involved. Graham Greene didn't want to be there, and
Mm.
Wells didn't want to, neither did Selznick. Joe Cosson knew that he wasn't first choice. Robert Mitchum's name was thrown around. Alida Valli,
Hmm.
she kind of was there by default because no one else was available at that time. So there was a lot of kind of, it was a film of convenience for the time. No one realized it was going to be this great classic. But as certain distance came from the film, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years afterwards, people look back and realize, oh, it was a creative high point for them. No, for you as well. So Carol Reed never reached the heights again. And it was a moment of realization many years later for them when they were being interviewed and their films were being reassessed. They realized, oh, that was a creative and commercial high point for us all.
Mm.
And the realization happened at different times, at different points in people's careers. Even though Carol Reed went on to win an Oscar for Oliver, after James Bond director, my favorite Bond director, Lewis Gilbert, had to back out of Oliver, he rang up Sir Carol Reed and said, can you take this project on? Otherwise, it may get cancelled. And Reed walked straight up the aisle to the Oscars and won Best Director from it. Lewis Gilbert must have been fuming.
I can only imagine.
So lots of moments like that. And as you say, lots of insights into what could have happened, what should have happened. They got through 3 cats at the time. The health and safety on the film didn't really exist as it does today. There was a big fire at Shepperton Studios in the edit room. So instead of waiting for the fire brigade, they grabbed people from different places, including a new kid who just started in the mailroom, sent him in, said, don't worry about yourself, get the film out. That was John Glenn, future Bond editor and Bond director. So I know you guys have interviewed him. I've listened to your episode 2 on that. So older films show little regard for people's welfare, for their safety, and yet manage to avoid any major catastrophes as well, which is quite surprising. But I always try and go in with my list of questions of I need to find answers for these. And I think that helps because if you're a real fan, you're only buying these books if you know the films really well.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to read as a puff piece that reads like a kind of a press kit that lists out people's previous credits and talks in glowing terms about the film. We know that. We're here. We're spending nearly £40 on a book. Tell me something I don't know. And so the pressure to reveal is quite high, but also visually finding unpublished images. Do you publish the best photo or the photos that haven't been seen before?
Mm-hmm.
Which are the best ones? You know, if you're a big fan of a certain Bond film, or as I am with the Doctor Who and the Daleks, I knew if it was something unpublished, I knew instantly when I saw it. I was like, wow, geez, look at that. But in terms of someone flicking through the book, do you want them to see the best photos or the most unpublished ones? Because they're not always the same. Because the best ones, the ones that are used for publicity purposes, are the ones that people know over and over. And yet they're not always that satisfying to see in a big sort of layout book of an art book like this. So there's always those challenges as well. And on a film you don't know that well, how do you know if it's unpublished? Where are you checking?
That's an excellent point. And I want to circle back to what you were talking about with John Glenn. I remember when we talked to John Glenn, he was telling us a story about Christopher Walken and how people had to keep track of Christopher Walken because he just kept disappearing. And I thought of that story when I was reading your book and all of the dealings with Orson Welles. Like, were you aware of that going in? And how much fun was it to kind of discover along the way of how difficult it was to get Orson Welles actually before the camera?
Well, I kind of knew he was elusive, and I thought, because having worked with actors myself, they can be elusive for different reasons. And I thought it might have been for this reason that he was anxious. He felt that the part wasn't something he could achieve, and so they had to really drag him to the set because he had a lack of confidence about playing this part, and the fact the film hinged on his character, so that everyone's talking about Harry. Where's Harry? Here comes Harry. And so there was enormous pressure. No, it was absolutely not that at all. It was simply that he didn't really want to be there. He did want the money. He didn't want to spend too much time. He's definitely not going into a sewer. So they had to rebuild the sewer down at Shepperton Studios for him. So that and the amount of money he got paid, which we've confirmed now, and his regret afterwards that he didn't ask for a percentage, because he could have got one, because they were so locked into having him. He would have earned a lot more from it. But it showed how little faith I think he had in the project. He knew it was a good film. Lots of good films have come and gone. Carol Reed and Graham Greene have made films together with Corder and great actors. We're not talking about them today. There's no book on the horizon. There's no 4K remaster coming. It costs more money to remaster this film by Studio Canal than it cost to make in its day. So it's kind of, what's kind of frustrating is that if you're finding out so many amazing facts, it's hard not to just list them all out and say, look, these are the top 50 amazing facts in this book. Here are some photos to go with it. You need to try and present it more in a documentary form, introduce things to people without running off and getting ahead of yourself. If we think of television documentaries now, they do something, and have for the last sort of 15 years, they put a bumper on the front. So after the station idents come off and it says, now an episode of this, you start to see aspects of what you're about to see in the next hour, more or less the best bits, with a voiceover explaining why you're here. I always try and go past the bumper straight to the opening title, because I don't want to see the best bits before I've watched the documentary. With readers, I found they like to be introduced much more slowly to things, and it needs to be a slower burn, so that when things are revealed in chapters and they're kept in their own lane, it has an effect. But rather than it seeming like separate articles, they have to all connect, and not just connect in a narrative linear fashion. People need to connect emotionally with it. They need to bring the information from the opening chapters through to the shoot, the post-production, to get a real sense of the task it was putting it together. People have said to me when they read my books, blimey, what a kerfuffle. You'd never think so watching the film. It's only an hour and a half. Whether it's Wicker Man or Flash Gordon, think, gosh, the trouble people went to make films. And I said, well, it still happens today, but people don't widely talk about it. On modern films, if you were to get one of the recent superhero films where someone's wearing spandex and all that, we know the sort of films we're talking about. I could never do a book like this. You'd never be allowed to talk about what went wrong and who had a mood and who didn't turn up and who was playing games and which producer was trying to get one over on the other. That'd be amazing. Wouldn't be allowed.
Yeah, I remember there was that series of making-ofs of the original Star Wars trilogy that were fantastic, and they brought the author back to do one for The Force Awakens and put the book together, and then Disney was like, no, we don't want these stories out there, so that book is in a vault somewhere. Yeah.
Was that Jonathan Rinsler? I knew Jonathan.
It was.
Yeah, I kind of hooked up with him a kind of year and a half before he died. And when I started doing my making of books, he's got a fabulous, although I haven't seen it, through Taschen, a making of The Shining. It's called The Shining Scrapbook. And I think it's £100, but it's like vast. It's like a couple of Bibles nailed together. So that's worth a look-see. But no, you're quite right there, Cam. If you're able to have free and full access to everyone, because there are so many interested parties in what are called sort of existing IPs, they are very reluctant to speak freely. So maybe in 50 years that book can come out then.
Yeah.
It's definitely something we've encountered over the years of doing interviews. You look at sort of the more modern spy movies, like the Bond films, for instance. We get a lot more no's when we put requests and feelers out for those than we do, say, a Roger Moore film.
Yeah. But you can get a sense of time has passed and people are no longer fully involved. Anthony Way, who was a kind of a senior Bond executive, was the first AD on the Doctor Who and the Daleks film. So he kind of gave me lots of insights, and he was worked on Clash of the Titans as well, which was fabulous. We did a podcast with him at the Harryhausen Foundation. So many of these guys from that era had worked on the Connery and Moore films. And it was quite a small Rolodex of people. It would be the same people kind of rolling over, whereas now it's vast battalions of crew, often who don't even meet each other in different lands.
Well, speaking of 007 and all things James Bond, you don't make a big point to celebrate too much in the book, but it is quite surprising how much the third man is connected to James Bond. Not only you mentioned John Glenn, but multiple actors, at least two or three, I think off the top of my head, are involved in Bond productions further down the line. There's one you point out in the book that I hadn't even realized was actually in the film. And I just, clearly as a Bond fan yourself as well, were you surprised by its sort of connective tissue to Bond? And yeah, just a little bit about that, really.
Yes, so there were so many actors like Bernard Lee, who was M, and there were other M actors in there. There was somebody who was doing the voiceover for Blofeld, uncredited. And then all the production personnel, Guy Hamilton, who was the first AD, first assistant director on Third Man, directed Bond. John Glenn, of course, the most prolific Bond director to date. And then the Lewis Gilbert connection, Lewis tentatively with Oliver being handed over to Sir Carol Reed. It was marvelous to see so many Bond connections. I suppose the one that most defines this book, this is a non-Bond book or an anti-Bond book in some ways, because Graham Greene, although he was a member of Secret Service, I'm not revealing anything there I shouldn't, the way he became a member of it and how he thought of the British establishment was very different to Ian Fleming, who was a patriot. Ian Fleming was a real patriot. He wanted to present a sophisticated and successful British intelligence service that won the day over the cruel foreigners who tried to invade this country with their technology and so on. Most of the Bond villains didn't speak with English accents, so I think we can all agree. Yeah. The only villains that spoke with English accents were the commanders of the Death Star, who all sounded like they went to Eton, didn't they? Most of them. Very good English there. A good career tip in the future: if you go to private school, you'll end up working for the Empire. So at least you'll get your clothes ironed, and that should be fun. So Graham Greene and Ian Fleming knew each other very well, but they had a kind of a clash of personalities. Ian Fleming was phenomenally successful for his brilliant writing of the James Bond novels. I think people often think that, I know you guys don't, but sometimes people think Ian Fleming became successful because they filmed his books, didn't they? And it's like, no. These books were incredibly successful, best-selling books, and of course amplified by the movies. Graham Greene didn't have the same commercial success, but he had enormous critical acclaim. And both men, I'm going to suggest, and I do in the book, were somewhat envious of each other's status. So when Graham Greene was going to stay at Ian Fleming's Goldeneye retreat, his holiday place, Ian Fleming said to him, look, by all means, stay there completely free of charge. All I'd like you to do is write a foreword or an introductory note to a little compilation of my books that are being reprinted in a small box of Bond editions. And it was like a foreword, if you like, or a note from Graham Greene, sort of saying these are wonderful and so on. And he said, no, I'd rather pay you the rent to stay at Goldeneye. And it's like, oh, that's awkward. That's a bit embarrassing. So there was always that kind of professional tension between the two men. And both of them knew John le Carré as well, who was much younger at the time. And all three had worked for British intelligence. But Graham Greene worked there because his sister was there. And his sister thought he could do with a bit more money because he traveled a lot, and asked him, do you fancy being a spy? Do you fancy being a British agent? And he was like, okay, if I can get to travel free and make some money as well. And so that's why he became a spy. And it's not a pre-title sequence you would have seen in a Bond film. You knock on M's office and say, oh, look, it's my sister. Hello. Do you fancy a bit more pin money? You go on then. Then your title sequence. It's not going to happen, So intelligence tends to be more, in terms of John le Carré's vision as well, a lot more admin and a lot more sort of men in small dark rooms smoking and drinking tea and muttering to themselves. And in terms of Graham Greene's writing, he was a travelogue writer as well. He wrote as a journalist, a very different style to Ian Fleming. And yet both men admired each other enormously. But Ian Fleming would never have stayed in touch with Kim Philby, this country's greatest tracer. And one of the things I had niggling at me when I started this book was, well, the film The Third Man came out in the late 1940s and was written especially as a film. It wasn't a book first. It was a novella that Graham Greene had created on instructions from Alexander Korda. So The Third Man, established in the late 40s, came out as a movie. Kim Philby was head of British intelligence, and it was his job to dig out any of the moles, any of the double agents, people who were being paid by the Russian government to spy basically on the British establishment.
Mm-hmm.
And the irony was that Graham Greene was employed by Philby. They were great friends. And when Philby was exposed then a couple of decades later as one of the Cambridge Five, the bizarre thing was, guess which one of the Cambridge Five he was? He was the third man of the Cambridge Five. It's like,
Yeah.
what? That's a numerological coincidence. So I spoke to Graham Greene's family about that, and about the fact that Greene stayed in touch with Kim Philby when he went to exile in Moscow, and wrote the foreword to Philby's memoir about being basically a big traitor. It's like, oh, okay. And Philby had a stamp as well. The Russian government had issued a stamp with Philby's face on it, and we nearly put it in the book, but then we didn't. So, Ian Fleming, I don't think would have pinned his faith and his friendship so clearly onto the lapel of Kim Philby. I think most people turn their back on Philby, and for good reason. So that is kind of quite bizarre, and it's still something that British establishment doesn't really talk about. And even the 30-year rule, where papers get released after 30 years and you can see things, there are still things that are sealed, and I think we won't find out in our lifetime. Why wasn't he and the other members of the Cambridge Five properly pursued and prosecuted? Strange. And what did Graham Greene know? And did he turn down a knighthood, which I think he did?
Right. And that was something that I really thought about a lot when I was reading your book, was Graham Greene is such a force of creativity in this era. And yet I feel like you ask people in 2024, his name is becoming less and less known. Whereas, like you say, Ian Fleming or John le Carré, people immediately will know it, partly because their work is still being adapted to major motion pictures or TV series. Do you feel like Graham Greene, kind of like Carol Reed, is someone who is almost in danger of being kind of not forgotten, but becoming less known over time?
Yes, I think you're quite right there. The reason Carol Reed wasn't considered to be an auteur or a filmmaker's filmmaker, he was considered to be much more of a working technician, was because of the types of films he made. It took the intervention of people like Peter Bogdanovich and Martin Scorsese to say, hang on a minute, something interesting was happening in British cinema. Let's revisit. Look at the camera work. Look at the oblique angles, the tilts, or actually the Deutsch tilts, to give them their correct name. They were wrongly rechristened Dutch tilts. That would never have been allowed in most rushes or dailies in American preview theaters. If you'd only directed one or two feature films and you went in with tilted rushes, you'd be fired. You'd be fired in the rushes room in the preview theater. So, Reed and Greene were doing things which America wasn't able to do at that time. Martin Scorsese talks extensively about how the film was very influential on him in terms of its pacing, in terms of use of music. Robert Kraska's photography, which was kind of groundbreaking at the time. French expressionist cinema did have this sort of look, but mainstream cinema didn't, and audiences didn't connect with it till this film. But you're right, he got forgotten. Greene has become forgotten. We don't think of this as Graham Greene's The Third Man, whereas we do think of it as Ian Fleming's The Spy Who Loved Me, even though he didn't actually write the screenplay for that. So there hasn't been a close association with it. Many of the films that were adapted from Greene's work were not commercially successful, so there hasn't been a sort of a rush to remake his films. No one's thought of remaking The Third Man. You might say, well, why would they? But there have been many sort of bizarre remakes that have come up over the years. But, I'm hoping that the film being recognized now, we have a chapter on Greene called The Real Life James Bond, where we talk about his exploits and what it was really like for him. I'm hoping that he'll be reassessed. The film has been reassessed. If you were a TV commissioner or an acquisitions head about 15 or 20 years ago, you could buy this film very, very cheaply to show on a wet rainy afternoon, or if you'd had a break in live transmission, you might cut to an interruption to regular programs. We're now going to show you The Third Man instead, because it was a very, very cheap film filler in the afternoon, and there's nothing in it that would offend. Now, that's not the case. They've gone back to the libraries of the rights holders. They've been brushed up into 4K. They're now quite expensive if you wanted to license the 4K for your channel to show it. So it's interesting how over time these have matured like fine wines. And now the Doctor Who and the Daleks films, which in the 70s were the standard bearer on the BBC. If they had a break in sports transmission on a Saturday, they throw on these films completely unscheduled. They won't do that now because the films have been reassessed. Other films from the time that had bigger budgets and bigger stars are being forgotten. So the currency around the status of The Third Man changes. It is like a stock market in terms of status and value, and it depends on us, the public, what we're prepared to pay for and what we're prepared to write books about. So I'm hoping it won't be forgotten again, but it will be discovered, hopefully, by many new viewers.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special report.
Red alert, Spyhards, we are shaking things up over on the Patreon page.
That's right, we are launching an exclusive new show where we tackle the exploits of the small screen's greatest secret agents, like Jack Bauer, George Smiley, and beyond.
And don't forget, every month you also get 2 Agents in the Field episodes where we decode the adventures of your favorite spy actors in their biggest non-spy movies. But Cam, tell the people what we have coming up next.
Scott, with Slow Horses Season 4 being the talk of the town right now, it is the ideal time for us to be tackling the second season of the show. And so we are reteaming with Jackson Lamb and the gang for round 2. Horse Hards, let's do this.
So strap on your Condor Man wings and soar into the future with us over at patreon.com/spyhards.
But before Big O zaps us with a red pulsating laser, let's get back to the Spy Jinx.
What do you think it is about The Third Man that has continued it to be a film that is spoken about, and perhaps have a small bit of an evolution in its later years? I think it is more in discussions now than it certainly wasn't, as you say. Like, the rights have definitely gone up since, and the lovely 4K transfer. Why do you think this film is still in the conversation when it comes to spy movies?
Well, I think there's 2 reasons. One, because it's a different view. It's not a view that's been often repeated. Had there been lots of sequels to The Third Man, and we talk about that in the book, there was a television series as well with Michael Rene. They tried to reinvent The Third Man in itself, and it wasn't possible. It was just this unique combination at the time of those actors at that time. But in the last 15 or 10 years at least, there's been a real malaise amongst the public in terms of new content that Hollywood is producing. And about 10 years ago, they said the death of physical media had happened. You weren't going to be buying DVDs in your supermarket as much as you used to. And yet there's been an emergence of something else. And it's these house brick size special editions where it's just one film with loads of extra bits and bobs. There's one coming out for The Third Man, which is going to be like mega expensive. And it's going to be like a thick house brick. It'll have one cut of the film in there on a 4K disc. There's a few different, I've written an essay for it. There'll be some postcards and so on. People are willing to spend more on an older film than they are perhaps on the latest Marvel or DC character universe film. So part of it, the film is being rediscovered because it hasn't been repeated in the last sort of 75 years to any great success or acclaim by anyone else. Mm-hmm. But also because people are turning their back on new content. There's very little new content coming out that's exciting people. And as a result, and it happened in lockdown, people were returning to older films. And that might be, Tootsie with Dustin Hoffman, or it might be The Shining, of course, which was not successful when it first came out and had bad reviews, now considered to be a classic. So films do have an opportunity to reinvent themselves. If you look at the catalogue of Terry Gilliam, I know Terry quite well. I've spoken to him about doing books of his films. Many of his films were The Adventures of Baron Munchausen. I'd love to do that book. And that's a bona fide solid gold flop in every sense. Mm-hmm. Bad reviews, bad production cycle, terrible box office, the most unsuccessful film made outside of Hollywood, I think, even to date. And yet now it's considered to be a mini classic. The Criterion Collection did a 4K remaster and so on. So I think our attitudes to success change. Also, it's dependent on the balance of what's happening with Hollywood. Are we happy with the current supply or not? And if we're not, then we tend to return to the past. People want a film, but they don't want to necessarily pick up a book. So how do you get somebody from looking at an older film and appreciating it more than they did to looking at the book? So it's kind of always a tricky balance. We haven't come a cropper yet, but I'm concerned that it's only just around the corner. We'll pick that film that no one wants to read a book about.
One of the things I thought was really interesting was the score for the film by Anton Karas, and that hugely celebrated at the time. Massive hit on radio in like the 1950s. But something that over time has become a little more polarizing. And, just your thoughts on that.
Yes, so the score wasn't liked at the time by David O. Selznick.
Yeah.
He felt it needed a proper orchestral score, and previous scores that had been written for Carol Reed's films were orchestral scores. So it was kind of a risk. Lots of the risks in the film, between the casting, between the photography, were ones that Carol Reed really took himself. But there was some controversy as to who came up with the idea of using Anton Karas and who discovered him, because two people claim to have discovered him. And Carol Reed says, I was eating in a restaurant at the time where all the crew went, and this guy was playing to us, and I discovered him that way. But Trevor Howard claims he discovered Anton Karas, and they both can't be right. So we had to kind of take a view on this as to who was most likely to be right. And when I spoke to the continuity lady who worked on the picture, who's still alive, it was her view, and it was my view as well. It was probably Carol Reed. But it's a tricky one, because some people find the music sort of monotonous, and they think that it doesn't suit. Look, if you take the view that David O. Selznick took, which this is travelogue style music, and it offers nothing. It doesn't bring emotion, it doesn't bring tension or humor, it doesn't punctuate a scene. I think that's missing the point of how the music is used. If you look at the music for Halloween in 1978, the John Carpenter original film, quite sparse, had to be, it was a lower budget film. And the music was used really more as a sound effect. And yet it had this monotony about it. It's real genius, of course, at the time to do that sort of score. Because if we think of other classic horror scores, Hitchcock with the psycho strings and so on, this was something very different that Carpenter was doing. But really, it has its roots in what Carol Reed did with the spotting sessions here with Anton Karas. Karas didn't know about spotting the film. It was Reed who was doing it. Reed brought him over to his house in London and worked through the film with him. We have pictures of that in the book that haven't been seen before. And it really was a case of creating something that would work for every scene. And I think the critics are still out on that. Some people think that it doesn't work and that it's kind of gets in the way of the drama. But I actually think when you hear that opening music, do 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 do, and you think, oh yeah, this is travelogue music. When you hear it by the end, it feels quite sinister to hear the same music played in that sinister way. Horror directors have done that in the past by using classic 50s style groups. I think there's a track on Halloween, isn't there? That's Mr. Sandman, which is a lovely track when you hear it in isolation, but when you see it in an opening sequence, I think the opening of Halloween 2 has that, and it's like, wow, I can't hear that track now without thinking of Dr. Loomis looking for Michael Myers. So I think if you are plugged into the film, the score will affect you in that way. And I think you can't unhear that music. People have said to me, it's like a music worm. It goes around in their ears, around and around. But I think that proves how successful it was. The music, the casting, the story, and the moment in time is what locks that success in. They tried to repeat it, not with Anton Karas, but in other situations and other films, and it just didn't happen. And I think there's lots of examples in cinema history of where people have all come together. They've had this creative lightning in a bottle moment, never to be repeated.
Well, I mean, I think the success of it really comes too from the protagonist of the film, played by Joseph Cotton, who is this seemingly fairly unsuccessful pulp author. He's known, but he's obviously not rich if he's showing up just to get a job with Harry Lime. But someone who kind of approaches the situation with kind of a romanticism, and the music kind of plays to that. And over time, this man is just gradually broken down, where, as you said, it feels sinister by the end. It's someone who had these kind of dreamy aspirations of, I'm going to a foreign locale, and slowly being pulled into a mystery and an adventure. And by the end, the woman's walking right past him, and he's just, throwing a cigarette on the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, people have read the film and said that Polly Martin's, played by Joe Cosson, represents America. He's come, with youth and vitality and with stories of the West, but incredibly naive, into a war zone, not understanding the politics or the language and not wanting to really understand it, but just find his friend. And it's quite a childlike quality he has in the film. I'm just here for my friend Harry, as if it's someone he's playing marbles with in the streets. And yet when you chase right to the end there, she walks right past him. When Joe Cotton lights up a cigarette, in reality, he thought that the shots had finished and he hadn't heard director Carol Reed shout cut. So he gets out some cigarettes and starts to light one up. And yet the take was still rolling. So that was unintentional on his behalf, and it was kept in the final cut. But I think the characters kind of work well. If it was recast, and in future years, you probably can recast this and do an AI version with different people in different roles and see what it looks like.
Uh-oh.
I think it would exactly. Yeah. Well, look, if there's money in it, and if you represent the estates of different well-known people like Robert Mitchum and the brilliant Cary Grant, it would be, yeah, you'd want to see that, wouldn't you? Cary Grant as Harry Lime. I'd want to see how that looked, and I'd probably pay a few dollars to take a look at that. So who knows?
In terms of the Third Man, I think we could probably go on for another few hours of celebrating the film. But one thing I just want to sort of touch on to wrap us up about this film particularly, because I think your book is the perfect encapsulation of the story of the film. I recommend people go and pick it up if they want to hear more about it. Visuals are so important in this film. We talked about the Dutch tilt, or the Deutsch tilt, as it were. And there's a whole great chapter about sort of filming the Third Man in the book. And also, you fill the book full of wonderful photography, as you say. You pulled some from the archive. There's even some photos like super grainy that I knew you wanted to have in because they were important shots to have. That's what I felt like. But for you, looking back on the film itself now, you've gone through the process of making this wonderful book. What do you think is the most impactful image from the Third Man?
I suppose it would be the first shot of Harry Lime caught in the light in the Viennese night, and he gives a wry little smile, and it's like Orson Welles saying, well, you've caught me, guys. For the moment you have me, but not for much longer. And I think that you can completely reread the film after reading my book and see the cat and mouse game that Lime played as a character reflected directly with Orson Welles as a person. There's no suggestion here that Orson Welles was a bad person. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. But in terms of the cat and mouse game he played with everyone, Harry Lime did exactly the same. He played a cat and mouse game with everyone, including his girlfriend, including his best friend, and never has a character and an actor merge more beautifully and more perfectly than that. And I think him being lit dramatically from a light being switched on above, I think is the classic moment for me, because it says it all. And he's looking at the audience smiling as if to say, they've caught me in the lights here, but not for much longer.
And I had a question for you. Have you gone to Vienna and gone on the Prater Ferris wheel?
I have. I've done all of that. And we had great help from the Third Man Museum in Vienna as well, who gave me lots of the unpublished images, lots of the different covers for the music, the sheet music and so on. Mm-hmm. And it's the world's only, as I believe so, the world's only single film museum. And if I may dare be so bold as to ask you, gents.
I know of another one.
Oh, do you? Oh, my goodness. What is it?
There is a Quiet Man Museum to the John Wayne film in Ireland.
I shall buy it and close it down immediately so we don't have to reprint the books. So, which museum would you guys want if you could have a single film museum and you had to be the curator as well? So you'd have to really love the film. Which films would you choose between you?
I mean, I think my answer is somehow Condor Man.
Condor Man?
Brilliant.
I wish I was mildly joking, but I've spent so much time obsessing over that film over the years and like collecting random bits of memorabilia. I just think like if there was someone that was going to tell the story of Condor Man, I'd like it to be me.
Have you got
Okay.
the soundtrack? There's a brilliant double disc soundtrack released by Entrada. I've got it behind me on the racks here somewhere.
It's in my CD shelf downstairs.
Brilliant, good stuff. A collector's item worth lots of money. It's probably not going to get reprinted.
It cost me a lot. Don't tell anyone.
I feel like for me, I mean, Bond is the easy answer, so I'm not going to say that. I think the movies that draw me in is kind of a mix of like the artistry is fascinating to dive into, but there's also like a fun factor. Like I never get tired of going back to those worlds and wanting to do that, which if I'm opening a museum, I got to be committed to spending a lot of time in that world. So I think of like, I guess two things. I think of the Evil Dead series, with Sam Raimi, and I think of the Tim Burton Batman films. I could like spend forever finding, props and posters and art from Batman Returns, for example.
Yeah, that's a really good one actually. I don't know what mine would be. I'm ashamed to say if it was Howard the Duck Museum, would I get many people coming? But that's not my choice. But it could be. It would be up there with other choices.
You might be smart though, because we're just like on the verge of Howard the Duck having a major comeback in the MCU. He's already popped up in Guardians films. You could be like ahead of the curve and about to be opening like the biggest film museum in the world.
Well, let's throw down the gauntlet. We'll each open our museums and see how many people we have over the threshold in a year's time, and we can come back for a rather interesting podcast.
Or a really depressing one.
This feels like a premise for a sitcom. Yes, for sure. Well, okay. Before we let you go, because I want to dig a little bit further into you and your books, just before we let you go. Now, we've mentioned some of the other ones you've written about. Do you have a favorite book of the ones you put together? If we're maybe going outside the Third Man, people want to pick up another book as well. Maybe one you point people towards.
It's tricky because they all have a sort of a different place in my heart. The Doctor Who and the Daleks one, I kind of really fought the case for that. So that really wouldn't be there if we hadn't done that. My very first book, which I thought was going to be my only ever published book, Harryhausen, The Lost Movies, covers all of the unmade films that Ray Harryhausen didn't make and sequences that were deleted from his films or he couldn't do for financial and technical reason. And it was 80. It was a total of 80. That was the kind of one that kicked it all off. And I think for people who want a book that they can just kind of flick through and have a quick look at something, maybe that's a good entry level one. All the others are a deep dive. They are like a public inquiry. If anyone's ever been to a public inquiry and looked at the printed documents and it's like thick as a couple of Argos catalogs, you need to be a big fan of a film to want to read it. But people who have not been fans have said, actually, I preferred your book over the film itself. And I think The Wicker Man's a case in point. The behind the scenes shenanigans on that film, which do involve a certain Mr. Sean Connery as well, do kind of light people's touch paper. And if you're into kind of a gossipy read, The Wicker Man might be one to pick up as well.
I do love a gossip. You've got me pegged there, so that's what I'll be picking up next. I need to know now because obviously we're talking about the Third Man, but you're an author. You've got your eye on the ball. What you're doing next can you tease us what the next project may or may not be?
My next book's already written and it comes out in February, and I signed an NDA on it because it's about a new film, and it gets announced. I was told it gets announced this month, but I'm not allowed to announce it until it's been announced by the folks. And it's a big film that comes out at the end of this year, and the book comes out in February. So if depending on when your podcast goes out, if they let me say it, I'll pop back on in this T-shirt, record something, and send it across to you. I can tell you what the new book is. So that's that. And there's another making of book coming my way in terms of the official story of the film, which I'm about to embark upon. But again, I've signed an NDA on that. But that's a really old film as well. It's not as old as The Third Man. But in the time it took me to finish The Third Man, I did this contemporary book, which is another big one. But it had the reverse problem of The Third Man. There was thousands of images, absolutely thousands. It's like, my God, how am I even going to look at the pictures in time to write this book? but that's coming out in Feb.
Well, you're being a true spy with us and only teasing us with information, and you're making us wonder about what might be coming next. So we'll keep an eye out for that, and depending on when this is dropped, we might be able to spoil a little bit at the end of the show. But the last question, John, I'm going to ask you. This has been asked to everyone, including John Glenn, we mentioned earlier. We talk about spy movies every week. I need to know, John Walsh, what is your favorite spy movie of all time?
I think it's probably, no, it is North by Northwest. It has to be. When I listen to you guys talking about the knock list and you've asked people the question, I'm always thinking, hang on, if it's not North by Northwest, what is it? And no, for me, it's quite simply North by Northwest. I even went to the Plaza Hotel into the Oak Bar because that's where he gets. It has to be North by Northwest. I saw that at film school. I was only 18 at the time. I absolutely loved it, and I've ordered the 4K, which comes out at the end of this year. And for me, it's definitely North by Northwest. I have favorite Bond films, and I have my eye on Bond for some books as well. So I know some of the folks down at Eon and Ian Fleming Publishing as well. My previous commissioner from Titan Books, Simon Ward, he moved to Ian Fleming Publishing.
Yeah.
And so between us, we've got our eye. I've got my eye fixed on 3 in particular, all from the same director, bizarrely. It's not because they're from that director, but they just happen to be my 3 favorite Bonds, which are not everyone's 3 favorites. But for me, favorite spy film, definitely North by Northwest.
I mean, that's a great pick and one that you really can't argue against. If you'd said the Third Man, that would also be a case where you really can't argue against it.
I should have chose the Third Man. What am I thinking? The publisher's going to think I'm such a Judas. And Studio Canal are going to be like, we support you all these years. Could you not have just said the Third Man? So yeah, the Third Man.
It's pretty good.
The power of editing. It's been the Third Man the whole time.
I was just doing a Kim Philby there, trying to pretend to be a traitor, but of course, no, I'm a company man. It's the Third Man.
You're throwing us off the scent. Yeah, exactly.
I was going to say, if depending when this podcast goes out, and I know you guys have different schedules coming up, I've got a London book signing for the Third Man on September the 28th, which is a Saturday at 2 p.m. at Forbidden Planet Megastore on Shaftesbury Avenue. So if people come along to that, I'll sign this book and any of my others if you want to bring them. And limited edition bookmarks are coming too. So you'll be able to pick up one of those for free.
Oh, awesome.
And do you need to book in for that, or is it just turn up?
No, it's just turn up. It's only a 1 hour window. So you basically get in a queue. And I think they normally allow little time after that because sometimes the queues gets a bit long. And particularly if people are bringing other books. And it's a great Christmas present, a signed book from me. It's near Christmas, and I won't wrap it for you, but I will write in it whatever you want me to. I'll write Happy Christmas.
Well, I'll say people go and pick up a copy there. But John, where can people find your books online? Where's the best place to send people to go? We'll put links in the show notes below for the signing and to pick up all the copies of the books. But where do you recommend?
It's in all bookshops. Amazon is good. You can get on Titan Books as well. And I'll be doing pre-signed ones or post-signed ones at forbiddenplanet.com. So any of those places you want to go. And I'm saying to people who can't come to my signing sessions, if you send me a screenshot of your Amazon or Goodreads review, I'll send you a signed book plate and a bookmark. Hopefully, if it's a nice review, though.
There you go.
There you go. There you go. John, it's been an absolute pleasure decoding the Third Man with you. Everyone go pick up a copy. I recommend it, and we both do. And I think you'll all enjoy revisiting the Third Man with John, ourselves, and the book.
Thanks, guys. It's been a pleasure.
Well, there you go, Cam. John Walsh was clearly our Third Man.
That's right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, I guess he has a permanent spot then at the microphone with us.
Yes. Well, maybe he has been here the whole time like any good spy, and we just didn't notice.
Okay. But I feel like if he's going to be here, we need that zither music opening and closing the show.
Maybe you could insert a little bit at the end just for the listeners.
Maybe I can.
And we teased before. You can win a copy of the book. We just spent an hour talking about it with John. I'm sure you're all salivating at the chance to get your hands on it. And we've got a copy to give away. There's going to be more details over on our Twitter page on the main post. But the gist will be, as long as you like and share the main post of the week, there'll be our pinned post with this episode. You'll be in with a chance to win the book. More details on Twitter. There'll also be a link in the show notes below to our Twitter page. You can head over there and find out more. But Cam, let's just talk about it for a second. We've never spoken about The Third Man, a seminal film in the spy oeuvre. What a word. And I'm glad we finally had a chance to do it for its 75th birthday.
This was so much fun. And John's book, this isn't even just like a plug because he was on the show and a fantastic guest. It's because genuinely I read this book and it offered so many stories that I had never heard before, and they were delightful. So I recommend people genuinely get a copy of this book because Guy Hamilton, celebrated James Bond director, played an unlikely role throughout The Third Man. Yes, he was the assistant director, but he did so much more. And I didn't know all the little details, and they are all laid out in the book, and they are so much fun, and some of them are really hilarious. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. John's book is packed with stories, and we did a really good job, I think, throughout the discussion, teasing some of these elements, a lot of the James Bond connections and things like that.
Sure.
But there's way more context and stories that go along with those details in the book.
Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, Cam and I were both sent preview copies of the book, but we're not being funded by Titan Books or anything like that. We both just fully endorse this book. This is the book of the film. If you love The Third Man, or you're curious about The Third Man or spy movie history, this book deserves to be on your shelf, and it will be joining the ranks of my spy reference books up on my shelf. Pride and joy for sure. Now, I mean, The Third Man itself, it seems to have a fascinating history about the fact that it shouldn't have even really been made when you look at all the things that could have gone wrong.
Yeah.
From Orson Welles not wanting to be part of it to the producers getting involved, like this feels like one of those magic moments in cinema that probably doesn't happen quite as much anymore. That everything just fell into place at the right time.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite details that John was bringing up, not just in the interview, but also in the book, was that we tend to think of classic films as these works of love, where it was like a passion project. It was, a team of artists who had a vision and they managed to succeed, even if there was like huge obstacles along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Not so much the case with The Third Man. A lot of people involved with The Third Man were like, it's either, a job, or at least a couple key ones were like, I don't really want to be involved in this, but I guess I got to do it anyway. And so it's so interesting when you have a movie that has had a massive legacy, is celebrated 75 years later, to kind of know that, people making this movie didn't have the context. They didn't understand. They didn't have the foresight to recognize what a special project it was, at least several of the people working on it. And how, John's book also lays out how later down the road, a lot of them kind of acknowledged, like, oh wow, I didn't really realize what we were working on.
And also goes to sort of lead to the legend. Orson Welles is celebrated for this film and has taken credit for a lot of it post the film's release. This book really lays out how much he actually had influence over the film compared to what he did and didn't do. And it's interesting that how he went from not wanting to be in the film to claiming all the good bits were him.
And having to be tracked down quite a bit because he would disappear. Yeah, there's like several funny stories, and also just kind of the muddled history of the film. There's the famous zither score that I referenced earlier on, and by Anton Karas, but there's all these different stories about how that score wound up in the movie. And John provides several different stories. So it's kind of like you can pick which one means the most to you ultimately. But I like the fact that he kind of realized there's no specific story for me to give it anymore. I should just include all of the stories, and you can kind of connect the dots, if you will.
It's like a choose your own adventure.
Exactly, yeah. And also this book gave me a lot of appreciation for Carol Reed. And we've talked about Carol Reed on the show, but he is someone who is something of a journeyman. And yet when you look at The Third Man, it's so specific. Its visuals, its style, it feels like the work of an auteur who had a genuine drive to make a story that would feel like totally unique. And yet, like, Carol Reed bounced all over the place, makes Oliver, just about 20 years later. And so I really appreciated the book for giving me much more insight into Carol Reed as an artist, and how, while he may have been someone who changed up his style all the time, very much was the driving force behind a lot of the artistry of The Third Man.
And for me, also a little bit of insight into Graham Greene.
Yes.
Which the book really spells out, like his connections to Kim Philby. I was not aware of any of that.
Yeah, and we've talked about both Philby and Graham Greene numerous times on the show.
Yeah, just didn't know those two sort of spy domains had intersected. Lovely, well, interesting and fascinating bit of history there. But and also, you talk about the rich visuals of the film. I think one thing the book does really well is keep that consistent. It's a very visually pleasing book. Not only is it full of great data and information about the Third Man, it's also really great to look at. Like it's got a lot of well-known photos from the film, but a lot of ones that have been like dug up from archives that you've never seen before, and it's a real page turner, and it just also would look good on your coffee table. I feel like I'm doing a hard sell on the book for people. That really isn't the case. There's no gun to my head here. It is a very good looking book.
And the thing is, we haven't talked about the Third Man yet.
No.
And so this was a really fun kind of introduction for people, kind of a hint as to what will come later down the road when we actually do a proper Third Man episode. But I had a ton of fun revisiting this movie. And the fact it's, the 75th anniversary, there's a lot of meaning there. But I was really surprised rewatching the movie how fast-paced it is, how quick people speak. Like, it is a movie that has a quick rhythm. It does not feel like a kind of slow, contemplative spy film that might turn some people off. It's very quick, and it's also very clean. A lot of film noir movies, they could be incredibly convoluted, where it's more about ultimately the mood and the style than following the plot point by point, because it gets very confusing. I think of like The Big Sleep with Humphrey Bogart. Like, that movie is just baffling to try to figure out. But this movie, it's, complex, but it's very clean storytelling, and I think a really inviting movie to a lot of people as well.
I wouldn't say it's like an entry-level spy film. I think that really falls to sort of the Bonds and things like that.
Sure.
But perhaps the next echelon.
It's not a movie that I think is going to be daunting for people who are kind of tipping their toes into 1940s classic spy films.
And if we're talking about things that surprised us about the Third Man, the thing that really surprised me, as this was my first foray into the Third Man, was just how little Orson Welles has to do with it, despite the fact that his presence looms large over the film's legacy, the film's marketing. He's on screen for, I think, did someone count it as like 18 minutes?
I feel like it's probably less.
Probably it might even be less. It's on IMDb trivia. I'm forgetting the exact number. It's probably in the book too, but he really isn't in the film all that much.
Yeah, like the two iconic visuals of the Third Man are Orson Welles and the Ferris wheel,
which Orson Welles is on.
Yeah, exactly. Like everything's kind of tied to the Harry Lime character and that location at the Prater amusement park in Vienna, which I visited and got to go on that Ferris wheel, which was much more expensive than I'm sure they would have paid back in those days.
Did you also open the door and start like counting people you would murder?
Yeah, that's not something you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to open the door of the Ferris wheel while it is going around in circles.
They've also tried. Boy, you tried.
They've also built like a whole kind of visitor center in the entrance. It's not like an outdoor thing you just climb into the car. It's you go into like kind of like a little enclosed kind of area where they've got like models of the park over time and what have you, and then you pay a considerable chunk of money and get on board the car. So they've made it a little more indoor. It was funny though. I was charmed watching the movie because Prater Park now is quite a bit bigger and a lot more immersive, and just let's just say you could spend easily a full day there doing rides. Whereas I look at the Prater in the Third Man and I'm like, it looks rather dinky.
Yeah, there's like the little horse ride and that's all you really see in the film.
Yeah, it's very modest.
Well, I think that also talks to, I think one of the things the film does really well is paint that post-war picture of Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
And also the book spells a lot of that out too. There's a whole section about Vienna and its history and sort of what led up to the point of the film and why it was picked for the film and why it was so influential on the story.
Mm-hmm.
Because this is not a Graham Greene book that was adapted. This is a Graham Greene story, which is, I think, the first time he did that.
Sure. Why not?
Don't quote me on that. Let's go. Yeah, it's our show. We could be wrong. Don't write us. Don't email us. We're often wrong anyway. But yeah, I'm learning a lot about this, and I think the reason why some people might be curious as to why we didn't review the film is because we knew this was coming, and I knew this book was on the horizon, and I think this book will help us along in our journey to eventually review the Third Man at some point down the road, because this is the sort of definitive article on how it was put together.
Yeah.
And so when Cam, you do your sort of decoding spiel at the beginning, the briefing, as I like to call it, it's all here for you.
Well, exactly. And one of the things about The Third Man, too, is it still feels so relevant. You see movies constantly pull from it, even today.
Constantly. Yep.
I had one moment that I just had never connected the dots, which is that Harry Lime, who's, the iconic villain of the film, they gave his wardrobe to Jack Napier in Tim Burton's Batman. So when you see Jack Nicholson at the Axis Chemical Plant walking around, he's wearing the exact same outfit, and that Axis Chemical Plant sequence is staged quite similarly to the sewer sequence in The Third Man.
I'd never made that connection.
Yeah.
Wow. Like they chose the exact same outfit.
He's wearing like the black jacket and the same hat. Yeah.
Oh. I mean, of all the people, I could understand Tim Burton being influenced by this film.
I mean, film noir is all over that 1989 Batman, but I had never realized the Third Man connection.
Well, you're learning all sorts of things here on Spy Hards, and we hope you had a good time celebrating the Third Man's 75th birthday with us. Go out and grab a copy of the book. Win a copy on our Twitter page. Find out more about that on Twitter. And of course, pick up a copy of the new Studio Canal 4K release if you can as well, and celebrate the Third Man in glorious 4K.
Yes, do it. Do it, folks.
But Cam, I love to ask this question because it means we're coming back next week and we haven't been cancelled. What are we talking about next week?
Scott, grab a mint julep and let's celebrate because Goldfinger is turning 60. Now, we did our episode with Calvin Dyson on Goldfinger a ways back, quite a ways back now, but you know what? We have a SpyMaster interview for you that we think you're all going to really enjoy. We are going to talk to Norman Wanstall, who was the sound designer of most of the Connery Bond films, including Goldfinger. Want to hear about how they made the sound of Oddjob's hat? He's going to tell you. Do you want to hear about, for example, in Dr. No, when Dr. No is crushing a cup in his hand? He's going to tell you, and so much more. There's a ton of stories. He also worked on the Ipcris file, and also Never Say Never Again. And there's some stories involved with that one as well. So tune in for this. This is going to be an absolute blast with someone who's, I think, an under-recognized icon of the Bond era. Someone who is so instrumental to what Bond is. And so we're going to give him his flowers.
Absolutely. Norman Wanstall, he's the man with the Midas touch. We can't wait to share this SpyMaster interview with you. We had it sort of locked down for a little while now. I've been sitting on it and waiting for the special Goldfinger date to release it to you all. So your mission, folks, should you choose to accept it, is to join us next week as we celebrate Goldfinger's 60th birthday. It's a ton of birthdays here at the moment. And sit down with an Oscar winner, Mr. Norman Wanstall. If you like what you heard on this episode, please consider joining us over on our Patreon page, patreon.com/spyhards. Links in the show notes below. You can click that, head right on over. Multiple tiers to join at. Just show your love and support for SpyHards. If you can spare the dime, we would always appreciate it. Make sure to follow us over on social media at SpyHards. That's SPYHARDS. Make sure to check out our Twitter to find out how you can win a copy of John Walsh's new book, The Third Man, the official story of the film, due out on the 24th of September worldwide. But until next week, folks, you'll find Cam and I pondering the question: the zither or the slide whistle? Which was better?